Maxwell Granger's black SUV rolled smoothly through the busy streets of downtown Chicago, its sleek body cutting through the afternoon rush hour like a hot knife through butter. He sat back in his plush leather seat, the low hum of classical music softly filling the car, a calm oasis in the otherwise chaotic world around him. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the armrest was the only other sound that accompanied the melody. And for a man like Maxwell, this was normal. Life was all about precision, about winning, about never letting distractions interfere with the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. At 42, Maxwell was everything he had set out to be, an influential figure in the corporate world. A billionaire, a master of the stock market, and the proud owner of a multi-million-dollar empire. He was always looking for the next big opportunity, the next step in securing his place as one of the most powerful figures in the country. In a city like Chicago, where skyscrapers reached for the sky and the streets hummed with the pulse of ambition, Maxwell felt at home. But this day would turn out to be different. It was a typical afternoon. Traffic was heavy, the noise of honking horns and muffled conversations spilling out of cafes and shops filled the air. The light turned red, and Maxwell's car rolled to a stop in the middle of a busy intersection. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, his gaze wandering absent-mindedly out of the window, when something unusual caught his eye. In the middle of the bustling intersection, a woman sat in a wheelchair, her hands grasping a small bouquet of flowers. She was offering them to the drivers, her face tired but determined. She had a soft, almost fragile aura about her. Two small boys, no older than 6, stood beside her, their tiny hands grasping the sides of her wheelchair, pushing it forward with effort. They seemed so out of place in the frantic pace of the city around them. Yet they had an undeniable sense of purpose. Maxwell, normally too absorbed in his thoughts to be distracted by street vendors or beggars, found his attention fixated on the trio. It wasn't their situation that stood out, it was something else. As the boys shuffled closer to his car, Maxwell noticed something striking. They looked familiar. It was as if he had seen their faces before, but he couldn't quite place where. The taller of the two boys, a little one with messy brown hair and wide, innocent eyes, walked up to the car and smiled shyly. "Excuse me, sir," he said softly, holding out the flowers. "Would you like to buy a bouquet? It's for our mom." Maxwell blinked, taken aback by the boy's polite demeanor. Without thinking, he fumbled through his wallet and handed the boy a $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said quickly. The boy smiled and gave a soft thank you before stepping back, joining his brother at the wheelchair. As the light changed and the sound of impatient honking filled the air, Maxwell felt a strange pull in his chest. His hand returned to the steering wheel, but his mind lingered on the encounter. Why did those kids look so much like him? Could it just be a coincidence? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, and drove off into the congested streets of Chicago. But no matter how hard he tried to push it aside, he couldn't shake the image of the woman and the boys. There was something about them, something that stirred a long-buried feeling inside him, one he hadn't experienced in years. He had been so focused on his career and his empire that he hadn't noticed the emptiness growing inside him, a hole he had learned to ignore. Maxwell arrived at his sleek office building, the city's skyline stretching out before him. His assistant, Marissa, was waiting at the door to hand him his schedule for the day. Maxwell barely acknowledged her as he walked into the elevator, his mind still preoccupied with the scene at the intersection. For the rest of the day, his meetings and calls felt like a blur. Every decision, every negotiation, was made with the usual detachment. But in the back of his mind, the image of those children lingered. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. Why did he feel so connected to them? Was there something he had missed? He couldn't explain it, but he felt as if fate had brought him into contact with them for a reason. Later that night, Maxwell sat in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the glittering lights of the city below. The skyline looked the same as it always did, unfazed, unmoving, just like the life he had built for himself. But inside, Maxwell felt something had shifted. The bouquet the boy had given him lay untouched on the table, the soft scent of lavender and roses drifting up to his nose. For a moment, he let the flowers fill his senses, but then something inside him snapped. He needed answers. The woman, Sarah, and the boys, they weren't just strangers. He had to know more. He had to understand why he felt such a powerful connection to them. The next morning, Maxwell's thoughts were consumed with the mystery. He didn't have time for distractions. But this was something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about curiosity, it was about the nagging feeling deep inside that something significant was waiting to be uncovered. Maxwell woke up early the next morning, the same relentless drive to succeed pushing him out of bed. But today was different. Despite his usual precision and order, his mind felt scattered. The encounter with the woman and the boys still gnawed at him, and it was becoming impossible to focus on anything else. As he sipped his coffee, his thoughts were consumed by the two small faces that seemed to mirror his own. The green eyes, the jawline, everything about them was too uncanny to be dismissed as coincidence. He had spent the entire night trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't like him to be haunted by a fleeting interaction, but there was something about those children, something that tugged at his conscience in a way nothing had in years. Maxwell didn't believe in fate. He never had. Everything in his life was built on his ability to control outcomes, to shake the world around him with his determination and intellect. But now, for the first time, he was questioning himself. Could these children be his? Could they be part of his past? A past he had worked hard to forget. After hours of restless pondering, Maxwell made up his mind. He couldn't move on with his day until he had answers. He was a man of action, and if there was a mystery to solve, he would solve it. His first step was clear. He needed to find the woman, Sarah, and the boys. But how? Maxwell wasn't used to uncertainty. Everything in his life had always been within reach: his empire, his wealth, his influence. But this was different. He didn't know where to start. He called his trusted assistant, Marissa, and asked her to find out anything she could about Sarah Wilson, the woman from the intersection. Marissa was efficient and resourceful, always managing to get things done quickly. He had no doubt she would be able to track her down. But Maxwell couldn't wait around for someone else to handle it. He needed to see her himself, to look into her eyes and hear her story firsthand. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Meetings, emails, phone calls. Maxwell tried his best to remain focused on the tasks at hand. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah and the boys. The unease grew stronger as the hours went by, and by the time lunch came around, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. As he stood up from his desk, Maxwell's phone buzzed. It was a message from Marissa. I found her. Sarah Wilson. She lives in a modest neighborhood in South Chicago. I've attached the address. Should I make contact? Maxwell's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the address for a long moment before responding. No. I'll go myself. He left the office shortly after, the excitement and tension building inside him. The drive to South Chicago was long, and as he passed the gleaming buildings of downtown, Maxwell couldn't help but notice the stark contrast of the neighborhoods he was heading toward. The towering skyscrapers faded away, replaced by rows of worn-out homes, cracked sidewalks, and streetlights flickering in the early afternoon sun. Maxwell's luxury car seemed out of place in this part of the city. He parked on the street a few blocks away from Sarah's apartment, feeling a strange sense of nervousness. He had dealt with billion-dollar deals, international investors, and ruthless competitors. But now, standing in front of an unfamiliar building, he felt a sense of vulnerability he hadn't experienced in years. For a moment, he questioned his decision. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a coincidence? No, he couldn't let himself think that way. He had to know the truth. Maxwell walked up to the apartment complex, his footsteps echoing in the quiet street. The building was old, its bricks chipped and faded. He could hear the faint hum of children playing somewhere nearby. their laughter rising up from the alley. As he reached the door to Sarah's apartment, he hesitated for a moment, then rang the bell. There was a long pause before the door creaked open. Sarah stood there, her face guarded, her eyes scanning him suspiciously. She was dressed simply in an old sweater and jeans. And though she was in a wheelchair, there was something about her that was strong, resilient even. Her eyes were sharp, but there was a quiet sadness behind them, as if she had seen too much of life's hardship. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and caution. Her gaze flickered over him, as if she were trying to understand who he was and why he had come. Maxwell took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to understand what happened." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The apartment was small, yet cozy. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the walls were adorned with simple family photos. A few toys were scattered on the floor, and crayon drawings decorated the fridge. It was clear that this was a home, but it was a home weighed down by years of struggle and hardship. "Are the boys here?" Maxwell asked, his voice softening as he looked around. Sarah nodded, gesturing to the other room. "They're in there." Maxwell followed her inside, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but seeing the small, simple apartment made him feel like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. He had built his life around wealth and success, but here, in this space, it was clear that love and family were the things that truly mattered. As he sat down on the couch, Maxwell took a deep breath. It was now or never. "I saw you at the intersection yesterday," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. "You and the boys, I think they might be my sons." Sarah froze. The room seemed to grow still as the words hung in the air between them. She didn't speak at first, her eyes filled with a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "What does it matter now?" Maxwell's heart sank. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. The truth was finally coming to light. But how would Sarah react? How would the boys react? "I didn't know," Maxwell said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know about them. I didn't know about you." Maxwell sat in the small apartment, the tension thick in the air as Sarah's words lingered. "I didn't know about you," he repeated, the weight of his admission sinking in. "I didn't know I had children." He stared at Sarah, searching her face for some kind of reaction, some hint of how she felt after all these years of silence. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the city beyond the thin walls. Sarah's expression didn't change at first. She stood by the door, her arms crossed over her chest, a deep frown etched on her face. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Maxwell couldn't tell if she was processing what he had said or if she was simply trying to hold back her emotions. He wanted to ask her more questions, to understand everything about their past, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Then, finally, Sarah spoke, her voice quieter than before but still full of emotion. "You didn't know, after all these years. You didn't know. I sent you emails. I hired a lawyer. I tried to get in touch with you, and you ignored me. You ignored us." Her words were sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and Maxwell could feel the guilt weighing heavier on his chest with every word. "I never saw any emails," Maxwell said, his voice strained. "I never got your messages. I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know about the boys." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You didn't care enough to check. You were too busy with your career, your wealth. I was just some woman in your past, someone you could forget. But these boys, they're not something I could forget. Maxwell, they're a part of me." Maxwell felt a lump form in his throat as Sarah's words hit him hard. He had spent so many years climbing the ladder of success, building his empire, but in doing so, he had closed himself off from anything personal, anything that didn't serve his ambition. And now, standing in this small apartment, facing the consequences of his indifference, he realized just how much he had lost. Before he could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Sarah's eyes softened for a moment as she moved toward the door. She opened it slowly, and in walked two small boys, Liam and Noah. They were no older than 6. Their faces bright with innocence and curiosity. The moment they saw Maxwell sitting on the couch, their expressions changed, and they shyly stood behind their mother. Maxwell stood up, his heart racing. He knew, without a doubt, that these were his children. Their green eyes, their features, they were unmistakable. For the first time in his life, he found himself speechless, unsure of how to approach the situation. How do you face two children you never knew existed? How do you make them understand who you are? And more importantly, how do you make them trust you? Liam, the older of the two, stepped forward cautiously. His small hand reached out toward Maxwell, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "Hi," Liam said softly, his voice small but clear. "Are you our dad?" Maxwell's breath caught in his throat. The word dad seemed foreign to him, as if it didn't belong to his world. He had never thought about fatherhood, never imagined what it would be like to be responsible for another life. Yet, here he was, facing the undeniable reality of his own children. Maxwell swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. But nothing seemed adequate. I didn't know," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know I had you." Noah, the younger boy, looked up at his brother, then back at Maxwell. "Are you going to stay with us now?" he asked, his voice full of hope. But there was a trace of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure how to trust the man sitting in front of him. Maxwell didn't know how to respond. He hadn't expected this moment of raw vulnerability that had been brought to him by two children who had no reason to trust him, yet were still asking for his presence in their lives. How could he explain to them the years of ignorance, the years he had spent in pursuit of wealth, while they had struggled without him? "I want to," Maxwell said slowly, his voice more steady now. "I want to be here. For you, for both of you." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "You can't just walk in here and expect everything to be okay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You've been absent for so long. You don't just get to erase all the pain and hardship we've been through. You've got a lot to prove." Maxwell nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. She was right. There was so much he needed to make up for, so much he had failed to do for them. But he was determined now. He wasn't going to walk away, no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. As he looked at Liam and Noah, Maxwell made a silent vow. He would prove to them that he was more than just a man who had abandoned them. He would be the father they deserved, no matter how long it took. The next few weeks were a blur for Maxwell. He tried to focus on the business, but his mind was consumed by the family he had never known. He spent every free moment he had with Sarah and the boys, trying to rebuild the relationship that had been lost, trying to earn their trust. But it wasn't easy. Sarah, still hurt by the years of neglect, was reluctant to let him in, and the boys, though they were curious about him, kept their distance. They had grown up without him, and it would take time to heal the wounds his absence had caused. Maxwell called in favors from his connections to help Sarah. He hired a lawyer to investigate the past legal troubles she had faced, the ones that had been ignored by the system, including the lawyer who had stolen her money. But even with all the resources he had at his disposal, he couldn't change the past. All he could do was move forward, and show Sarah and the boys that he was committed to making things right. One evening, as he sat with Liam and Noah, playing a game in the small living room, Sarah watched from the doorway, her arms crossed. The boys were laughing, their faces bright, and for the first time, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She was starting to see the man who was sitting with her children, not just the millionaire who had once ignored their existence. Maxwell looked up from the game and caught her eye. He saw something in her expression, a flicker of hope, of trust. It was a moment he had been waiting for, a sign that maybe, just maybe, things could be different, but there was still so much to do. And Maxwell knew that the hardest part was still ahead of him. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on Maxwell only grew. As the weeks passed, he found himself struggling to balance his life in the corporate world with his new role as a father. Each day felt like a battle. He was fighting not just to rebuild his relationship with Liam and Noah, but also to gain Sarah's trust, something that seemed to slip further away with every mistake he made. Every time he thought he was making progress, a new obstacle emerged. It was exhausting, frustrating, and humbling. At first, Sarah had been distant and skeptical. She'd agreed to let Maxwell spend time with the boys, but her heart was guarded, unwilling to let him get too close. She had every right to be that way. She had spent years alone, raising Liam and Noah without any help from the man who should have been there from the beginning. Every word Maxwell said, every gesture he made, seemed to be met with resistance. But over time, there were moments when Sarah's walls began to crack. She saw how much he was trying, how much he was willing to change. Still, she couldn't forget the past, the years of silence, the unanswered messages, the pain of raising 2 children on her own. It wasn't something she could simply erase. Even if Maxwell was finally showing up now, Maxwell, for his part, was doing everything he could to prove himself. He wasn't just throwing money at the situation, he was showing up. Being present, he spent hours with the boys, taking them to parks, playing video games, helping them with schoolwork, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough, at least not in Sarah's eyes. She watched him carefully, weighing every word he spoke, every action he took. She wanted to believe in him, but the wounds of the past were deep, and they couldn't be healed with just a few kind gestures. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, Maxwell found himself standing at the window of his penthouse apartment, looking out over the city. The skyline was beautiful, as always, but today, it felt empty. He had everything he could ever want: money, success, power, but none of it mattered. Not now, not when the 2 people who mattered most to him were just a few miles away. And he felt so far removed from them. He knew he had to do more. But what? What could he do to prove to Sarah, to Liam and Noah, that he was serious? He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the years of neglect and indifference. All he could do was make things right from here on out. The answer came to him unexpectedly, in the form of a phone call from his lawyer. The man on the other end of the line spoke with a sense of urgency. "Maxwell, I've got some news. We've found the lawyer who scammed Sarah. He's been under investigation for a while now. I've got everything ready to move forward with legal action. But it's going to be a long, drawn-out process. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Maxwell's grip tightened around the phone. He had been so focused on fixing his relationship with Sarah and the boys that he had almost forgotten about the injustice she had suffered. The lawyer who had stolen Sarah's money was still out there, living his life without consequences, while Sarah had been left to fight alone. Maxwell had the power to change that, to finally right that wrong. "Yes," Maxwell said, his voice steady. "We're going after him, and this time, we don't stop until he pays for what he did." He hung up the phone, his mind made up. This was it. This was the way he could show Sarah that he wasn't just some rich man who was using his money to solve everything. He was willing to fight, to go through the difficult process of exposing the lawyer's crimes, to make sure that Sarah and the boys got the justice they deserved. The next day, Maxwell called Sarah. He knew she wouldn't be thrilled to hear from him, but he also knew this was something that could change everything. He needed her to trust him, to see that he wasn't just doing this for his own sake. When Sarah answered, there was a coldness in her voice. "What is it, Maxwell? I need you to listen," he said, his tone urgent. "I'm going after the lawyer who scammed you. I'm starting the legal process today. This isn't about money, it's about justice. I won't let him get away with it anymore." For a long time, there was silence on the other end of the line. Maxwell's heart raced as he waited for Sarah's response. He wasn't sure what she would say, but he knew this was important. It wasn't just a way to fix the past, it was a way to show her that he was committed to making things right. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her voice was quieter now, tinged with emotion. "You really mean it, don't you? You're not just doing this to make yourself feel better." "I mean it," Maxwell replied firmly. "I want to make this right. Sarah, for you, for Liam and Noah." There was a pause, and for a moment, Maxwell thought she might hang up on him. But then, she sighed deeply. "Okay," she said, "if you're serious about this, then let's do it. But I'm not doing it for you, Maxwell. I'm doing it for my boys." Maxwell could hear the exhaustion in her voice. But there was also something else, something that sounded like the first real hint of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. They were still far from a happy ending, but it was a step in the right direction. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, legal meetings, and hours of strategy sessions. Maxwell's lawyer had gathered enough evidence to bring charges against the corrupt attorney, and the case quickly made its way through the system. But as much as Maxwell wanted to focus solely on this, he knew he still had work to do with Sarah and the boys. Legal battles were important, but so was rebuilding his family. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Maxwell returned to Sarah's apartment, where the boys were waiting for him. It had become a ritual of sorts. He would come by every evening, play with the boys, and help them with whatever they needed. He could see the difference in their attitudes. They were beginning to warm to him, though it was still a slow process. As he walked through the door, Liam and Noah jumped up from the couch, running toward him with smiles on their faces. It was small, but it was a start. Maxwell kneeled down, his heart swelling as Liam handed him a drawing he had made earlier that day. "This is for you, Dad," Liam said, his voice shy but full of hope. Maxwell took the drawing, his eyes misting over. He had never been called Dad before, not by anyone other than his own father. But that had never meant the same. This moment, though, was different. It was real. It was his second chance. Maxwell smiled and hugged both boys tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling more grateful than he had ever felt in his life. "This is the best gift I've ever gotten." Sarah stood in the doorway, watching them, her expression unreadable. But for the first time, Maxwell didn't feel the need to explain himself or apologize. He was here, and that was all that mattered. Maxwell's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. What had begun as a fleeting moment of recognition on the busy streets of Chicago had spiraled into a journey that tested his patience, his resolve, and most importantly, his heart. He had fought tooth and nail to rebuild the relationships he had once neglected. And although the process was slow, he was making progress. The relationship with Liam and Noah was fragile, but it was there, small smiles, tentative moments of trust. He could feel it growing, little by little, but there was still so much left to repair. Sarah, though she had agreed to move forward, had not fully opened herself to Maxwell. She had every right to be guarded. Her trust had been shattered years ago, and although she was beginning to see his efforts, the walls she had built around herself weren't coming down easily. Maxwell knew that if he wanted to be the father his children deserved and the man Sarah needed, he had to prove it, not just in words, but in actions. The legal battle against the corrupt lawyer had become a symbol of his determination to fix the wrongs of the past. But he knew it wouldn't be enough to win Sarah's heart. One day, after a particularly challenging day at work, Maxwell found himself standing in his office, staring out at the city. The skyline stretched out before him, a reflection of everything he had built. He had fought his way to the top of the corporate ladder. But now, standing in the midst of it all, he realized that the power he had amassed meant very little compared to the love and connection he had neglected for so long. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Marissa, his assistant, entered with a stack of papers in her hands. She set him down on his desk. "Maxwell, I have an update on the case," she said. "The lawyer who scammed Sarah is being arraigned. His hearing is scheduled for next week." Maxwell nodded, feeling a surge of determination. This was his chance to make sure that the man who had caused so much harm to Sarah and her family would finally face justice. But as the days passed and the hearing grew closer, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about winning in court. It was about winning in life, about proving to Sarah, to Liam, and to Noah, that he could be more than just a businessman. He could be a father. He could be a man who would never walk away again. On the day of the hearing, Maxwell stood in the courtroom, watching as the corrupt lawyer was led in, shackled and defeated. The man, once so confident, now looked small and broken. Maxwell's lawyer spoke on his behalf, presenting evidence that showed the full extent of the lawyer's fraudulent actions. Maxwell listened intently, his mind focused on the outcome. This wasn't just about securing a victory for himself. This was about giving Sarah and her children the justice they deserved. As the lawyer was led away in handcuffs, Maxwell felt a sense of finality wash over him. This chapter of his life had come to a close, but he knew that his journey toward redemption had only just begun. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was a road he was ready to walk. That evening, Maxwell drove to Sarah's apartment. He had promised the boys that he would be there to help them with their homework. And he wasn't about to break that promise. But as he arrived, he saw Sarah standing outside, looking up at the stars. She wasn't alone. Liam and Noah were sitting on the porch, their heads bent low as they worked on their homework. Maxwell walked toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment. "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I'm here now. I'm here to stay." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. It was a flicker of hope, a flicker of belief. "You're right," she said quietly. "You can't change the past, but maybe you can change the future. For them, for all of us." Maxwell smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This wasn't the moment of complete reconciliation, but it was a start. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. As they sat down on the porch, Sarah and Maxwell watched as Liam and Noah worked through their school assignments, their heads bent in concentration. It was a simple scene, but it felt like everything Maxwell had been working toward. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He just needed to be present. He needed to be the father and the man Sarah had always hoped he could be. Over the next few months, things slowly began to change. Sarah's walls didn't come down overnight, but with each passing day, she saw Maxwell's commitment to their family. He wasn't just showing up, he was doing the work. He spent more time with the boys, took them to school, helped them with their projects, and even learned to appreciate the quiet moments of family life that he had once dismissed as unimportant. Liam and Noah, too, began to trust him more. They started to include him in their games, to ask for his advice on things that mattered to them. Maxwell was learning to be patient, to be understanding, and most importantly, to be there for them, no matter what. One evening, after a long day, Maxwell was sitting in the living room with the boys, watching a movie. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The sound of laughter filled the room as Liam and Noah joked with each other, their faces alight with happiness. For the first time in years, Maxwell allowed himself to relax. He was no longer a man consumed by ambition. He was no longer just the billionaire who had everything. He was a father, and for the first time, that was enough. As the movie ended, Liam turned to Maxwell with a smile. "Dad," he said shyly, "can we do this again tomorrow?" Maxwell's heart swelled with emotion. He had heard that word before, but it had never felt so real. He nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Of course, Liam, we'll do this every day if you want." Sarah came into the room, her eyes softening as she watched the scene unfold. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to keep her guard up. She was starting to believe that maybe this was the family they were meant to be. Maybe, just maybe, they could heal the wounds of the past and build something new. Maxwell knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges. moments of doubt, and perhaps even setbacks. But he had come to understand something profound, that redemption wasn't just about making up for past mistakes. It was about showing up, being present, and doing the work every single day. As he looked at his family, Maxwell realized that this was the real success. This was the life he had always wanted, but had never known how to find. And now, he had it. Together, they would rebuild their future, one day at a time.